Welcome. This is For Rent Method, quick turning lease options for fast cash. My name is Jeffrey Smith. Introduction. In this presentation, there is some legal information which is not legal advice. I am not an attorney. I've been educated by experienced attorneys, and I have researched legal opinions and court conclusions as the basis for my interpretations. I believe that my interpretations and recommendations are beneficial for the generalized situations described herein. Always get legal advice from your own attorney according to your situation. Summary of topics. Introduction, summary of topics, wholesaling lease option explanation, financial structure, describe basic calculations, detail lines for seller-side financing parameters, senior tranche, detail lines for seller-side junior tranche, detail lines for seller-side blended tranche, detail lines for buyer-side financing parameters, blended tranche. Legal issues. Equitable mortgage. Doctrine of equitable conversion. Sandwich lease option. Licensing. Dodd-Frank legislation. Exemptions for the owner offering seller financing to owner-occupant. Residential mortgage loan originator. Licensed underwriter. Guru issues. Joe Crump forms, lease option memo, other Joe Crump documents. My CLOTWA Excel spreadsheet and my Word dynamic mail merge templates. CLOTWA is an acronym for Convert Lease Option to Wraparound. That's a very big name for a spreadsheet, so I just use the acronym. Brief CLOTWA demonstration video. My forms for the For Rent method. Letter of intent, master lease option buyer, lease option memo, option for lease option, addendum financing MLO buyer, addendum provisions buyer, option to purchase long buyer, master lease agreement buyer, offer to purchase real property seller, assignment of master lease and option for cash, assignment of option contract for cash, limited power of attorney multiple listing service MLS, statement of understanding, general liability release from the buyer and the seller. Conclusion. Wholesaling a lease with option deal. This is a kind of quick-turning houses, which is like wholesaling houses that are move-in ready. You call or text the For Rent by Owner Furbo ads to find owners who are receptive to leasing the property and then selling for its full value price to a buyer who can deliver all cash at the final closing. Use the lease with option offer to an owner when you want to assign the contracts to a tenant buyer for a cash assignment fee, and then you are completely out of the deal. The owner is the landlord for the tenant that you found. This is the technique recommended for startups who have no cash flow for servicing debt if a tenant vacates. The property remains someone else's responsibility. This is deedless transacting for a cash assignment fee. The owner receives from the tenant buyer the security deposit and the first month of rent. For a $200,000 property, you receive the assignment fee from the tenant buyer of, say, $8,000 to $16,000, Your assignment fee is 4% to 8% of the property value. Remind the owner that less than 30% will exercise the option. If your tenant buyer decides to buy now rather than immediately rent, then that is simply a matter of exercising the option to buy realty. You receive your fee for assigning, that is, selling your contractual position on the transaction. Financial structure. Financial structure for quick-turning a lease-with-option deal. Financially structuring the lease-with-option quick-turn deal is simple. Determine from the owner the required monthly payment and how much of that payment applies to the paydown, that is, applied monthly rent credit of the balance owed. The applied monthly rent credit is multiplied by the number of months for the lease term, and that amount is added to the owner's desired sell price. The sum is the gross purchase price for the seller side of the transaction. You will mark up that gross purchase price with your assignment fee for the buyer side of the transaction. The lease agreement specifies the difference of the total monthly payment minus the applied monthly rent credit. This payment represents an interest-only payment on the owner's desired sell price. The option to buy realty contract specifies the applied monthly rent credit as the periodic principal-only payment that is applied to reduce dollar for dollar the gross purchase price. Each payment extends the option for another month. Missing a payment expires the option. At the end of the lease term, the gross purchase price is reduced to the owner's desired sell price by deducting the applied monthly rent credit for each month of the lease term. The option to buy realty contract can be exercised at any time during the lease term to pay the remaining balance of the gross purchase price. Financial structure presented to owner. The senior tranche is a lease agreement. Financing parameters. Senior tranche, the owner's sell price, $300,000. Junior tranche, this is the monthly rent credit. The total amount is $14,400. Adding together the senior and junior tranche is the blended tranche. This is the marked up sell price, $314,400. This is the part that's financed. The senior tranche is the lease agreement. Annual interest rate, 8%. Amortization periods, 9999. This means it's an interest-only tranche. Maturity periods, 36. That's 3 years. Senior periodic payment, $2,000 monthly. Senior annual payment, $24,000 per year. Senior present value, $300,000. This is the seller's desired sell price. Maturity amount, $300,000. This is interest only. There's no reduction in principal. Total interest paid, $72,000. Total periodic payments, $72,000. That's 36 times the periodic payment of $2,000. Redemption at maturity, $300,000. Total cash paid, $372,000. Financial structure presented to owner. The junior tranche is the option contract. This is a principal-only tranche. Annual effective yield, 0%, principal only. Amortization periods, 36. That's 3 years. Maturity periods in 3 years. Junior periodic payment, $400 per month. Annual payment, $4,800 per month. Junior present value, $14,400. Maturity amount, 0. Principal reduction, $14,400. Total interest paid, 0. Total periodic payments, $14,400. 36 payments of $400 each. Redemption at maturity, 0. Total cash paid, $14,400. Financial structure presented to owner, the blended tranche. Blended financing parameters. Annual interest rate, 7.8003%. Amortization periods, 294.39. That's about 24 and a half years. If you were to fully amortize this financing all the way down to 0. However, there is a balloon payment after 36 payments, 3 years. Senior periodic payment. This is the lease payment, $2,000. Junior periodic payment. This is the monthly rent credit, $400. Blended periodic payment, $2,400 per month. Blended annual payment is $28,800. Senior present value, $300,000. Junior present value, $14,400. Blended present value, $314,400. This is the total financed price for the property. Maturity amount, $300,000. This is the balloon payment after the junior tranche has been fully paid off. This is the seller's desired sell price after 3 years. Principal reduction, $14,400. Total interest paid, $72,000. Total periodic payments, $86,400. That's 36 payments of $2,400. Redemption at maturity, $300,000. Total blended financing paid, $386,400. Financial structure presented to tenant buyer. This is how you calculate the asset purchase price for your tenant buyer. Financing parameters. The senior tranche, $300,000. Junior tranche, $14,400. Blended tranche. This is the seller's price to your tenant buyer. Adding in your assignment fee, $23,500. The asset purchase price from your tenant buyer's perspective is $337,900. Blended financing parameters. Blended present value, $314,400. Maturity amount, $300,000. Principal reduction, $14,400. Total interest paid, $72,000. Total periodic payments, $86,400. Redemption at maturity, $300,000. Total blended financing paid, $386,400. Assignment fee, this is paid at closing when you assign the deal to your tenant buyer. $23,500 goes into your pocket. Total cash paid, $409,900. Total interest paid, $72,000. The asset purchase price, $337,900. Now, when I talk about interest in these calculations, that is more correctly described as yield, because you're not offering a loan, you're offering a lease with option. This is the description of that financial structure in equivalent financing terms. Your paycheck, from the Joe Crump style. In the financial structure example, your paycheck is by an assignment agreement that transfers to the real tenant buyer your contractual position in the transaction in exchange for a lump sum cash assignment fee. The recommended assignment fee is between 5% and 10% of the marked up purchase price and at least $10,000, which is added to the blended tranche to calculate the marked up gross purchase price to the tenant buyer. Thus, you are receiving the effective initial option consideration from the tenant buyer as your assignment fee. Therefore, the tenant buyer is paying an effective purchase price of the blended tranche plus your assignment fee plus his closing costs. The owner is receiving compensation for the delayed sale in the form of the total applied rent credit, which offsets the owner's loss of price appreciation. The tenant buyer may exercise the option at any time to pay the remaining balance due without reducing the desired sell price due to the owner. In the Joe Crump version, you are both the lessee and the optionee in the transaction, and you are at risk for contractual performance, and then you assign, that is, you sell your contractual position to your third-party tenant buyer, and then you are completely out of the deal. You cannot assign your contractual position until you countersign the contracts. You sign the agreements at a simultaneous closing with the owner, the third-party tenant buyer, and you. Thus, you are a principal party to the transaction only for a few minutes until the assignment agreement is executed. Legal issues. In this presentation, there is some legal information which is not legal advice. I am not an attorney. I've been educated by experienced attorneys, and I have researched legal opinions and court conclusions as the basis for my interpretations. I believe that my interpretations and recommendations are beneficial for the generalized situations described herein. Always get legal advice from your own attorney according to your situation. Legal issues. The equitable mortgage. Number 1. The equitable mortgage issue. Many misinformed judges have created flawed case law, in my humble, not legal opinion, due to ignorance of the doctrine of equitable conversion. A lease with option to buy that has applied monthly rent credit that reduces the final balance owing seems to look like a mortgage loan, often called an equitable mortgage, because there is no written mortgage document, which is a security instrument recorded on the property title to secure the repayment of a loan. The reasoning is that the initial option consideration is applied to reduce the purchase price, which is like a down payment, and then the applied monthly rent credits reduce the balance owing at exercise, which is like an amortizing loan. And then the final balance owing must be paid in full, which is like a balloon payment. If it looks like a duck, waddles like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. How do you like that for reasoned legal principles and respecting contract law? The judge deems the transaction as an equitable mortgage, and thus the landlord cannot evict the tenant for non-payment of rent, because the tenant is really an owner and must be foreclosed with a judicial foreclosure action, like a contract for deed, CFD. This only happens in residential real estate. There is no written mortgage or deed of trust. Thus, a judicial action is required to foreclose the implied CFD by creating a contract that is contrary to what the parties originally intended and memorialized in writing. Robin Hood sitting on the bench. Commercial real estate is about contracts. Residential real estate is about people. Dolph DeRoos, real estate investor. The doctrine of equitable conversion states that equitable interests in the asset are converted, that is, exchanged between parties, when a non-contingent executory contract is signed by both buyer and seller as a purchase and sale agreement, PSA. The seller's equitable interest in the asset is transferred from the seller to the buyer, and the buyer's equitable interest in the funds, notes, or other property to pay for the asset is transferred from the buyer to the seller. This conceptually happens exactly when the PSA is fully signed and becomes executory or executed, that is, when the parties are fully committed to completing the transaction. This does not happen for a contingent contract when there remain conditions precedent to the contract becoming executory or executed. Therefore, an option contract represents merely a contractual interest in the underlying asset and not an equitable interest, because the option is merely a contract to hold open an offer to buy or sell under certain pricing and payment parameters for a specific time period, exactly like a PSA that is signed only by one party that is bound by specific performance to complete the transaction upon countersigning the contract by the other party, and cannot withdraw the contract before acceptance. The initial option consideration is like a non-refundable earnest money deposit, EMD, to compensate the effective optionor, the party who signed the PSA, for accepting the risk and burden of specific performance. There can be no exchange of equitable interest until the option contract is exercised and creates an executory contract. An unexercised option is the same status as before the counterparty signs the PSA. Thus, an unexercised option contract cannot exchange equitable interest because a non-countersigned PSA is not executory. Until the option is exercised, that is, the PSA is countersigned, the optionee cannot offer a security instrument against the property title to secure a loan without having equitable interest in the property. An option contract for realty attaches a PSA that is notarized only by the optionor. The optionee countersigns the PSA to exercise the option, thus creating an executory contract. An option contract for personalty has an assignment agreement. Number 2, the sandwich lease option issue. This is very similar to the equitable mortgage issue. An investor signs a lease with option with the owner and then offers another lease with option to a tenant buyer. The problem is that the investor has no equitable interest in the property and therefore cannot offer to a third party an option to buy that property. The simple solution is to offer to the tenant buyer an option to buy the option contract, which is personal property, that the investor holds with the owner. The tenant buyer exercises the option by signing the attached assignment agreement and now owns the investor's option contract with the owner, and then exercises that option to buy the property by signing the attached purchase and sale agreement, the PSA, as the buyer, and then closing the transaction. See the real estate licensing issue about assigning a PSA or an option contract. In most states, there are no licensing issues with assigning contracts. In some states, like Illinois, licensing is required to assign a PSA or an option contract. Legal issues, licensing. Real estate licensing, assignments. Important. This topic requires legal advice from your attorney according to your specific situation. Different judges may interpret differently the same law. In general, you will not need to be licensed when you are a principal party to the transactions in this presentation. However, some state legislatures, such as Illinois, have capitulated to the high-pressure lobbying efforts of the Realtor Association special interest groups to suppress competition, and thus enacted legislation to require a real estate license when you engage more than once per year in a business pattern of dealing in contracts or options for realty. You cannot delegate to retaining the services of a real estate licensee. When closing as an original signatory party to the realty contract or option, you are exempt from licensing because you are not dealing, that is, buying, selling, exchanging, in realty contracts or options. This affects wholesalers as which you are effectively operating when your intent is to assign your contractual position to an unrelated third party. You must pay a tax to realtors for your surviving the risks to earn a living by your own efforts by obtaining a real estate license. Legal issues: achieving the effect of assignment without licensing. Illinois Statute Excerpt of Public Act 101-0357, Section 1-10. Whether for another or themselves, engages in a pattern of business of buying, selling, offering to buy or sell, marketing or sale, exchanging, or otherwise dealing in contracts, including assignable contracts, for the purchase or sale of, or buys, sells, offers to buy or sell, or otherwise deals in options on real estate or improvements thereon. For purposes of this definition, an individual or entity will be found to have engaged in a pattern of business if the individual or entity by itself or with any combination of other individuals or entities, whether as partners or common owners, in another entity, has engaged in one or more of these practices on 2 or more occasions in any 12-month period. Your real estate attorney must advise you about your situation regarding how to achieve the same effect as assignment, because you cannot simply retain the services of a real estate licensee. Be careful. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. Judges grant themselves wide interpreting latitude. The penalty for operating without a license is $25,000 maximum per incident. Realtors don't want competition from the free market. The intent is to convey legal control and close in the original signatory name specified on the contract. Your intended assignee pays a fee to the optionor, that is, the seller, for a backup option contract under the same parameters as your existing option contract. And then the optionor simultaneously pays that fee to you as a termination fee to cancel your primary option contract. Then the backup option contract is automatically promoted to first position in the transaction with your intended assignee as the original optionee, rather than as an assignee. A similar transaction may operate with a backup contract for a lease agreement or a PSA, so that the optionor and the intended assignee are the original principal parties named in the replacement contract, and the previous contract is terminated, that is, never completed or closed. The intent is to convey legal control and close in the original signatory name specified on the contract. Use a new Illinois-type land trust, also called a revocable grantor trust. The trustee, not you, signs the contract. and then you assign your beneficial interest of the trust, which is personalty, to your intended assignee. Your assignee now controls the trust, and thus controls the contract with the trust name as the original principal party. Each trust must have a unique trustee name. The intent is to convey legal control and close in the original signatory name specified on the contract. A new limited liability company, LLC, is created as a principal party to sign the contract, and the membership interests of the LLC are assigned to an unrelated third party. The LLC remains the original principal party name specified on the contract and is now controlled by the assignee. Each new LLC must have a unique general manager signatory. The intent is to convey legal control and close in the original signatory name specified on the contract. Use an option to buy an option contract, which is an option contract to buy personalty. Your name is not on the realty contract or option. Step number 1. The optionor signs PSA. The counter-signature line is blank. Step number 2. Attach the PSA to the option to buy realty contract. Step number 3. The optionor signs the option contract. The counter-signature line is blank. Step number 4. Attach the option to buy realty to the option to buy an option contract. Then the parties both sign the option to buy an option executory contract, which is assignable without a license because it is for personalty, not realty. An assignment agreement conveys the personalty ownership of the option to buy an option executory contract to the new optionee. The option to buy an option contract is executed, that is completed, by the then current optionee by countersigning the option to buy realty contract. The option to buy realty contract is now executory with original signatures. The optionee can countersign the attached PSA to exercise as an original signatory. In Illinois or any other state that requires licensing for assignments of realty paper, you may decide that the easiest path to enter or stay in business is to obtain a real estate license. Licensing is a serious decision because there are issues for holding a real estate license. Licensing requires many hours of expensive initial education and formal testing. You must carry personal insurance for errors and omissions coverage because you cannot use a liability shield such as a corporation or limited liability company, an LLC. Every year you must pay fees and successfully pass continuing education courses. For the first few years, you must earn experience by hanging your license under the supervision of an employing broker, who will take a significant percentage of your commissions and control what transactions you are allowed. If you cannot find a broker to allow you to deal in realty contracts and options, then you are out of the contract assignment business until you can qualify for your own independent broker license. To have access to the Multiple Listing Service, MLS, you must become a member of the political special interest groups of the Realtor Associations. You must pay fees for membership to the MLS services and to all of the associations that own those MLS services that you need, and to the National Association of Realtors. Fees on top of fees. Realtors caused the 2008 meltdown by failing their duty to protect their clients. Without question. Legal issues, Dodd-Frank legislation. Many real estate gurus are misinformed of the Dodd-Frank federal legislation. Thus, they are misinforming their students about the compliance issues. The Dodd-Frank legislation as it pertains to seller financing applies only to selling a 1 to 4 dwelling unit residential property to an owner-occupant buyer. A non-owner-occupant buyer is exempt. This means that you can buy with seller financing without a residential mortgage loan originator, RMLO, license, unless the state has statutes requiring the RMLO license. The lease with option, when the payment has an applied monthly rent credit, or when the option includes seller financing for exercising the option, also must comply with the legislation. No rent credit and no seller financing for exercising the option, that is, the buyer must cash out the seller, is exempt. Always check with your attorney about such requirements because the laws and regulations often change. Dodd-Frank exemptions for owners offering seller financing to owner-occupants. Exemptions apply when selling to an owner-occupant buyer, a consumer, and number 1, the seller is selling one property in any 12-month period, and all of these conditions are true. The seller is a natural person. The seller did not construct the property. Do not attempt to exchange your property with another builder's property and then offer seller financing. The financing has a fixed rate and does not adjust for the first 5 years. The borrower has a reasonable ability to repay ATR certification for the loan. No negative amortization, that is, deficit interest. Or point number 2, the seller is selling 3 properties in any 12-month period, and all of these conditions are true. The seller is a corporation, LLC, partnership, trust, estate, etc., a legal entity. The seller did not construct the property. No shenanigans with exchanges between builders. The financing has a fixed rate and does not adjust for the first 5 years. No negative amortization, that is, deficit interest. The borrower has a reasonable ability to repay the loan. No balloon payment. Don't even think about jacking up the interest rate after 5 years to force the debtor to refinance the loan. The exemptions are intended to obviate the need for a seller to obtain a residential mortgage loan originator, RMLO, license, or to retain the services of an RMLO to qualify the buyer. Non-exempt transactions require the RMLO. If you are conveying the property to a non-owner occupant, such as selling to a landlord, then the RMLO is not required. The legislation intends to protect financially illiterate owner-occupant residential buyers. As a business operator, you will not qualify for the seller exemptions without the RMLO to sell the home to an owner-occupant buyer. Therefore, the buyer must retain the services of the RMLO to qualify as an owner-occupant for the ability to repay and to provide the required disclosures for the financing parameters. The buyer pays the RMLO service fee. Popular guru issues. Joe Crump. Various versions of the for-rent method have been around for a few decades. The version described here has been popularized by the real estate guru Joe Crump. I never recommend any guru mentoring, coaching, or boot camps. Joe Crump has a low-cost ebook on Amazon Kindle, Automated Real Estate Investing, that explains his business model in detail with scripts and forms. He has a big YouTube channel. Joe Crump is selling his online automation services for a monthly service fee of about $200. A prepaid bulk purchase includes an extensive home study course. Joe Crump provides his free for rent method legal documents at his joecrump.com/forms website. I provide alternative sample forms that resolve the legal issues of the Joe Crump forms. My forms are Microsoft 365 Word dynamic mail merge templates for generating from my Excel macro-enabled spreadsheet with all of the calculated fields filled in. You can generate the form and then save as a customized PDF file for obtaining e-signatures. Always have your legal forms reviewed by your attorney for your specific situation. The Joe Crump legal forms are: number 1, lease option memo. This is the short memorandum that the owner signs for you to act as a principal party in the transaction. This is a non-binding letter of intent, LOI, in my humble opinion. Joe Crump recommends providing a web form on your website for the owner to provide the information that is automatically emailed to you or to your virtual assistant. A fully signed paper LOI or an accepted digital LOI is non-binding, and therefore you are not a principal party to the transaction. The Joe Crump LOI also specifically states that your duty is to find a third party to acquire the realty under the terms of a new lease agreement and option contract, which is exactly acting as a broker. And that requires a real estate license in all states, regardless of Joe Crump's assertions otherwise. Number 2, the tenant application. A potential tenant buyer must fill out this form. Also ask the prospect to pull their credit report for you from annualcreditreport.com or another similar service. You want a reasonable expectation that the option to buy can be exercised to cash out the seller. This form is an ordinary tenant application, so you or the owner can use any similar form that conforms to the equal housing regulations and to your local housing regulations. Number 3, resident documents. A, first right of purchase. This is the real option contract, not the lease option memo. It provides for an annual increase in the purchase price. I do not recommend increasing the purchase price. The tenant buyer is paying the mortgage and maintenance costs, so they should have the benefit of locking in the price, just like they are the owner. For the next occupant, the owner can change the lease payment or the option price after it terminates. Do not set up the tenant buyer for failure. The owner and the tenant buyer sign this contract. Resident documents. Document B, Statement of Understanding. This is a disclosure document that declares the tenant buyer understands that he is a tenant and not an owner. The intent is to avoid the equitable mortgage problem explained elsewhere that some misinformed judges have created in case law. The tenant buyer signs this disclosure. C, Residency Agreement. This is the real lease agreement. It provides for an annual increase in the monthly rent, which I do not recommend. The tenant buyer deserves a fixed payment as if it were fixed rate financing. For the next occupant, the owner can change the lease payment or the option price after it terminates. The owner, the lessor, and the tenant buyer, the lessee, sign this contract. Resident Documents Addendum. This is effectively an assignment agreement that sells your option contract to the tenant buyer. It also acts as a general release for you to exit the transaction without liability and for you to receive your fee. You, the owner, and the tenant buyer all sign this document. In Illinois, this assignment requires you to be licensed. Convert lease option to wraparound, CLOTWA. The CLOTWA spreadsheet and mail merge templates is designed for a variety of situations for buying and selling with seller financing for wraparound notes and lease with option. The description in this presentation is for using my mail merge forms for the for rent method strategy. The CLOTWA spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is my Microsoft 365 Excel macro-enabled spreadsheet for analyzing data to acquire control of a property with seller financing as either a lease with option or a wraparound note, a WRAP, with an all-inclusive trust deed, AITD, and either holding the property for rental income or quick turning the property to an unrelated third-party buyer on a lease with option or a WRAP and AITD, or simply assigning for a cash fee. Important. The CLOTWA Excel spreadsheet and the Word mail merge templates are designed only for Windows 10. The CLOTWA spreadsheet. The CLOTWA spreadsheet has over 100 Microsoft 365 Word mail merge templates that process the data exported from the CLOTWA spreadsheet to plain text files for import into Microsoft 365 Word. The forms can be saved as PDF files for emailing or for secure e-signatures as needed. The CLOTWA spreadsheet has built-in macros for processing the data for the specified parameters in the for rent method strategy, and the dynamic mail merge templates detect this situation and customize the generated forms. The mail merge templates receive data from a plain text file with 3,000 columns that was produced from the CLOTWA spreadsheet. There are two variations of the plain text files. CSV, comma-separated values text file that has exactly one data row, or TXT, tab-delimited text file that has many data rows. When you process one data row, typical usage, you can use either text format. You must use the TXT format when you process more data rows. The functions for managing the data rows are performed by simple push buttons in the CLOTWA spreadsheet. The data can be imported and exported as text formulae to preserve your custom Excel calculations. Portfolio controls. The Portfolio Controls section manages the portfolio data. The data is saved as Excel formulae to preserve your custom calculations in the input cells. The Fetch button retrieves the data from the specified row. The Store button saves the data into the specified row. The Delete button erases and removes the specified row. The action renumbers subsequent rows. The Add button adds a row of data to the portfolio. The Clear button erases all portfolio data. The Export button saves the portfolio data to an external plain text file. The Import button brings in that portfolio data. If there is already portfolio data, then the spreadsheet will ask for your permission to append that data to the existing data. The Build button builds the mail merge data from the portfolio data. The Save button saves the mail merge data to an external TXT tab-delimited plain text file. The Join button builds mail merge data by merging data from the specified other portfolio table. Analyze the property data in the CLOTWA spreadsheet and then save that spreadsheet in a property folder created for that specific property. I recommend including the property street address as a prefix in the file name and in the property folder name. In the Portfolio Controls section, add the data row to the portfolio worksheet by clicking the Add button. Click the Build button to generate the TXT plain text data rows in a special worksheet. Click the Save button to save that worksheet, plain text data, into the property folder as a TXT plain text file. Save the spreadsheet. CLOTWA demonstration video. Welcome. This is Convert Lease Option to Wraparound Financing Spreadsheet. My name is Jeffrey Smith. This is a short demonstration video for using the spreadsheet to calculate the parameters for a for rent method transaction. You find a motivated seller who is receptive to selling the property on a lease with option. And then you connect that seller with a motivated buyer who is unable or unwilling to acquire bank financing to purchase the property now, but will lease the property with an option to buy, and at some later date, in 2 or 3 years, will be able to qualify for new bank financing to cash out the seller. The general method is to ask the seller what monthly payment they want and how much of that they will use for a applied monthly rent credit. Take the rent credit, multiply it by the number of months in the lease term, and then add that to the fair market value of the property, so that by the end of the lease term, the marked up price has been paid down through the applied rent credits, and then the buyer can get a bank loan and pay off the remainder of the property. So we start with the spreadsheet. Let's reset it to its initial state. And then we will go to the portfolio controls and clear it, starting fresh. And now we've specified the fair market value is $300,000. Down here in the lease option term, we'll use 36 months. And then we'll click No Debt, because we don't care about the debt. Click Set FRM, which is for rent method parameters. And now the spreadsheet is set up with the financial parameters. You will also want to go to the Superb Seller worksheet and specify the seller's name and contact information, and to the Best Buyer worksheet, specify your best buyer's contact information, and then you'll be able to add the data to the portfolio controls. This creates a data row. And now you'll be able to build the mail merge data from this information that you've assigned to the property-specific input cells. Now in the for rent method, there is the Joe Crump way of doing it, which is where you become a principal party as a lessee and an optionee, and then you will assign your contractual position to the buyer that you found. Thus, your name appears on the contracts, and there will be assignment clauses in those contracts allowing you to assign to a third party. Now, in my way of doing this, we add one level of indirection to this, where we create an option to lease with option. So you have an option contract with the seller, where the seller has agreed to enter into a lease with option transaction with a third party, and therefore the lease agreement and the option to buy contract have a blank spot for the lessee and the optionee. Now, you have another contract with the seller, which is the option to lease with option. When you exercise that option, or you assign that option to a third party, and that third party exercises the option, the optionee will then sign the lease agreement and the option to buy contract, and will then enter that transaction. So to do that, we go down here and notice that we have the turn on for rent method. This is the flag that's detected by the dynamic mail merge templates. There's also taking title on seller wrap. This flag is also used when you are using the Joe Crump method of becoming a bound principal party in the lease with option. You turn off this flag, add another data row with that flag turned off, and then you build the mail merge data. With that flag turned off, the dynamic mail merge templates will generate blanks where the lessee and optionee go in the lease with option transaction. Now that the mail merge data has been processed, we want to save it as a plain text file. Save the file. Now we can open up a mail merge template. We can see from the mailings that we're on record number 1. This file has already loaded in the plain text. We can see from this information, this is the Joe Crump version, so my name is listed as the lessee in the transaction. And this is all that we show the owner. We show the purchase price that the owner wants is $300,000. We're marking up that price with the applied rent credit for the duration of the lease option term. And now we have the blended junior and senior tranches as the blended financing parameters. So the monthly payment is $2,400. The beginning value is $314,400. At the end of the lease option term, that will be paid down to $300,000. So we've paid off $14,400 of principal, plus the interest in the transaction means that the total periodic payments are $86,400, which is 36 times the blended periodic payment. Adding to it the redemption value means that this transaction has generated $386,400 for the seller. If we look at record number 2, we now see that we've added some information. The assignment fee that will go into your pocket when you assign your option to the motivated buyer, $25,200. We've also guesstimated on the estimated closing costs of about $3,395. We really don't know what that is until the actual closing occurs, so it's just a guess. And the rest of this is the same. And now we have additional lines at the bottom showing that the motivated buyer has paid $386,400. That went to the seller of the property, plus your assignment fee. So the total cash paid by the motivated buyer is $411,600. We subtract the interest portion to calculate the asset purchase price. Now you would save this as a PDF file. Replacing the PDF file. In this scenario 2, this is my version of the for rent method where the lessee is left blank. This information will be filled in when your motivated buyer exercises the option after buying that option from you with the assignment fee. This has been Convert Lease Option to Wraparound Financing for Rent Method Parameters. My name is Jeffrey Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to serve. Open Microsoft 365 Word. Go to the File menu and click New to create a new mail merge document from one of the template forms. File Save As the docx file to the property folder. Go to the Mailings menu, select Recipients. Select Use an Existing List. Navigate to the property folder. Choose the TXT plaintext file that you saved from the Clotwa spreadsheet. Click OK on the next requestor. Mailings, Preview Results button to see the results. Then save as a PDF and then save the docx file. I suggest that you edit the templates to insert a JPEG picture for your signature in the signature line of each form, or you can use an e-signature service to stamp digitally that location when you email the PDF file. Save the pristine files in your Microsoft Templates directory. Then you can create as needed a new document from the template file and then save it in the property folder. I suggest that you save as the property spreadsheet with a name that includes the property street address as a prefix. For example, for property at 123 Main Street, you would prefix it with 123 Main Street Clotwa.xlsm. Then you can save the docx and .pdf files like this. Street name prefix, Clotwa, letter of intent, MLO buyer, PDF, and docx. Do this for each of the documents for that property folder. Each template offers a suggested file name for save as. Prepend the street address prefix in front of the file name and then save it. If you update the Clotwa spreadsheet, then rebuild the plain text file and save it in the property folder. Refresh the form files by opening and resaving each of the PDF and docx files. Number 1. Letter of intent, MLO buyer. After receiving the data from the owner of the asking price, monthly payment, applied monthly rent credit, and the lease term, then you can generate this dynamic mail merge form as a non-binding letter of intent, LOI, to email to the owner for an e-signature to verify the owner approves the financing. After approval, you can proceed to generate for e-signature either the lease option memo, not recommended, or the option for lease option contract, recommended. The Clotwa templates for rent method lease option memo. Number 2, lease option memo. This is my corrected version of the Joe Crump lease option memo that is a binding contingent contract for a lease with option arrangement between you and the owner. You or your assignee must accept the property to become an executory, that is, the parties are fully committed, contract. You are the lessee and optionee, and the owner is the lessor and optionor. After both parties sign this contract, you are now a real principal party, and you can accept the property for yourself, or you can assign your contractual position to your third-party tenant buyer that you found. In Illinois, assignment requires that you must be licensed. Option for lease option. This is the recommended form for you to be a principal party with the least risk. This is an option to buy personality contract to create a lease with option transaction with the owner. The lease agreement and the option to buy realty contract are signed and acknowledged, notarized only by the owner, and then attached to this option for lease option contract. The optionee exercises this option by countersigning the attached documents to become the lessee of the lease agreement and the optionee of the option to buy realty contract. Those contracts are now executory with original signatures. Addendum financing master lease option for the buyer. This is the detailed financing addendum attached to the lease agreement and the option to buy realty contract. The financing line items and other clauses are dynamically generated. Addendum provisions buyer. These are the usual and customary contract provisions regarding closing costs, due diligence, etc. Option to purchase long form for the buyer. This is the long form for the option to buy realty contract for your third-party tenant buyer. Master lease agreement for the buyer. This is the lease agreement for your third-party tenant buyer that is customized as a master or ordinary lease agreement. Offer to purchase real property. This is a short form executed purchase and sale agreement, PSA, that is attached to the option contract to be countersigned by the then current optionee to exercise the option to buy the property under the attached financing terms. No contingencies, because the then current optionee only countersigns this PSA when ready to exercise the option to buy and close the purchase. Thus, it is an executed PSA when countersigned. Assignment of master lease and option for cash. This is the combined assignment of the long forms of the lease agreement and the option to buy realty contract from you to your tenant buyer. You signed those contracts in a simultaneous closing with the owner, the tenant buyer, and you. You cannot assign a contract that you have not signed. This is required for the Joe Crump version of signing my lease option memo to become a principal party and then replacing that combined short form lease option with the long form contracts to be assigned to your tenant buyer. Number 10, assignment of option contract for cash. This is the recommended assignment of the option to lease option contract. You assign that short form option contract to your tenant buyer, who then exercises that option by countersigning the attached long form lease agreement and option to buy realty contract. You receive your cash assignment fee, and then you are out of the deal. The owner is the lessor and optionor, and the tenant buyer is the lessee and optionee. Limited power of attorney, multiple listing service. This form is signed by the owner to grant permission to you to market and advertise the property on the multiple listing service, the MLS, and on other marketing mediums. The MLS and some other marketing services need permission from the property owner, which this form grants to you. Statement of understanding. This is a disclosure form signed by the seller and tenant buyer to affirm their understanding that the tenant has no equitable interest in the property ownership. This is yet another notice to persuade a judge that the tenant buyer has no equitable interest in the property, and thus eviction is a valid remedy for defaulting on the monthly payment. General liability release from the buyer and from the seller. These forms are general releases of liability protecting you from transaction liability from the seller and the buyer. Always insist that these two forms are signed by the other parties before any of the other forms are signed in a concurrent closing. You do not want the other parties having buyer's or seller's remorse after the deal is closed or refusing to release you from liability after the other forms are signed. For rent method, conclusion. The for rent method is intended for generating cash assignment fees for introducing a receptive seller and a motivated buyer who is unable or unwilling to obtain new bank financing for purchasing a home. The ClotWa macro-enabled Excel spreadsheet and the dynamic Word mail merge templates greatly simplify the process of analyzing the financial parameters and then generating the important documents for the transaction. This has been Quick Turning Lease with Option for Rent Method. My name is Jeffrey Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to serve.